The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And at the start, I'd like to say I'll be splitting the time with the member for Sarnia-Lambton. Today will be a historic day for Canada and a day that will be looked back on for decades to come as a day of infamy for the rights of vulnerable, disabled, and mentally ill Canadians. Years from now, our country will be rocked by a political scandal when it is revealed how tens of thousands of vulnerable Canadians ended their lives through medical assistance in dying. We will discover how many of these vulnerable Canadians whose deaths were not reasonably foreseeable, who suffered from depression and other mental health challenges, were allowed to end their lives with little to no safeguards. Righteously angered families will demand justice from the government. They will demand parliamentary inquiries, and they will fight through the courts to reveal the truth. That truth being that for decades the government failed to support vulnerable Canadians and instead allowed them to end their lives in the absence of real assistance. And on that day, a Prime Minister will stand across the way in this House to give their tearful apology for the lives of so many lost by this government's negligence. Parliamentarians will vote for serious reform to affirm the lives of vulnerable people and reinstate firm restrictions to protect the rights of the disabled and mentally ill. And together on that day, we will vow never again to stand idly by and let legislation pass this House that would put vulnerable lives at risk. The vote we will have tonight will determine whether that is the bleak future this country will have. And today we have a choice as parliamentarians. Do we stand up for the rights of disabled Canadians, of those suffering with mental health challenges, or do we vote for radical legislation that will imperil many of their lives? And tonight I will vote with a clean conscience, knowing that I have done my duty to uphold the rights and dignity of Canadians. And I urge MPs in this House to look deep into their conscience and ask themselves if they want history to remember them as those who went along and voted for this travesty. Now, some members of the House may scoff at my claims, but if they won't take it from me, take it from the very people whose lives are being held in the balance because of this vote. Take it from the disability community, who have been speaking vocally about the pressure they face from society to end their own lives. Take it from suicide survivors, who know that under this legislation, their lives would have been ended before they could recover and live fulfilled lives. Now, the Liberal government likes to praise themselves for their deference to the experts, but in this case, they are kowtowing to special interests who are pushing a radical agenda. If they really wanted to craft a bill that reflected what the experts are saying, they would heed the words of Dr. Sonyu Gained, the former head of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. And I will note that Dr. Gained is live tweeting tonight's proceedings. Now, he has raised the alarm that doctors under this legislation, many of whom are not equipped to make judgments on whether or not a patient with mental health issues will be able to recover, will also be given the power to grant death to these patients. He has raised serious concerns about the motivations of this legislation, which in his words seek to grant more autonomy for privileged people to end their lives, but in the same hand seriously risks further marginalizing the lives of those who do not have the privilege of being able, of having a sound mind, or of having access to the best mental and physical life supports. He has raised the alarm that nowhere has anyone considered the risk of this legislation on those who are suffering with suicidal ideations. Where are the protections for those contemplating suicide? We recently commemorated International Women's Day, and I became aware recently that women are twice as likely to receive medical assistance in dying and are also twice as likely to attempt suicide. What analysis has been done to ensure that women, particularly disabled women, and those suffering with mental health challenges are not being marginalized by this legislation? And I think this can be said of a lot of racialized communities and others as well. Disability groups have pointed out that in a cruel irony, today is the 11th anniversary of Canada's decision to adopt the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Did the government plan this slap in the face for the lives of disabled people who struggle every day to live their lives and who will now soon live with the added struggle of the constant pressure to seek assistance to end their lives? And this year of all years, Madam Speaker, there is no excuse for ignorance when it comes to the plight of those suffering mental health challenges, for the disabled, and for those who are contemplating suicide. We have seen the significant impact that suicide is having on our society. In some cases, death by suicide has outstripped the deaths from COVID-19. And in a year where we have learned so much about the gaps in assistance and its fatal consequences, how can we move forward with this out of touch and radical legislation that seeks to make it even easier for vulnerable people to receive death? The situation that we have been placed in as parliamentarians in response to these proposed amendments from the Senate is precarious. Canadians are still adapting to the groundbreaking decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in its Carter decision. They're still grappling with the subsequent legislation passed in the last Parliament, which legalized medical assistance in dying. And now with the Truchon decision, we have been called to enact new changes less than 5 years into force of the previous medical assistance in dying legislation. And if that wasn't enough, now we're being asked by this Liberal government to go even further than the Truchon decision, which did not even consider mental illness as an exclusive justification for seeking and being granted medically assisted death. And we're being called now to pass this legislation in a rushed manner. I suspect, well, I know in my riding, if you ask the average Canadian if they want medical assistance in dying for minors or those with solely a mental illness, you would receive a resounding no. Yet, the overwhelmingly Liberal government-dominated Senate has taken it upon themselves to push the agenda of special interests forward to the detriment of vulnerable peoples. You know, it wasn't that long ago that the Supreme Court ruled that there was no right to a medically assisted death. And the Carter decision, I believe, was in many ways a deviation from the previous law. But today, to many, it may seem quite conservative because, at least in that case, the courts had a desire to place clear parameters around this novel practice. It's clear to me that the Minister of Justice wants to implement a radical agenda that would almost see euthanasia legalized for every occasion. And I think he said as much in his vote when he voted against the previous legislation. They didn't feel that Carter went far enough. They didn't feel that Truchon went far enough. And they couldn't get a pass through the House, so they got a pass through the Senate. The committee, the Justice Committee, did not contemplate mental health. And as much as they did contemplate mental health, they received testimony that advised against including mental health. There are so many Canadians who are going to be hurt devastatingly by the recklessness of this legislation. And Canadians have not had an opportunity to fully pass judgment on this legislation. And when we have an election in the next few months or years, we need the government to stake out a clear position on where they want to go with euthanasia before Canadians go to the polls. Because I don't recall any party in the last election putting forward a policy that said they wanted to seek mental illness inclusions in medical assistance in dying. The government does not have a mandate from Canadians to pass this radical legislation. So, Madam Speaker, it's time to be on the right side of history and stand with vulnerable Canadians against this dangerous and radical legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.